A baby elephant stood at the river until night was almost there, not because she was afraid of the water, but because she still believed her mother would come back and lead her across. No one knew that, behind that waiting, was a loss too big for a young creature to understand, a grief so deep she could not move beyond it. But the most painful part had not happened yet, because the very people trying to save her would have to do something so cruel, it seemed certain to break her all over again. And then, 9 months later, that same little elephant who once refused to cross had become something that left everyone speechless. The river had been shrinking for weeks, pulling back from its own banks as if the dry season had frightened even the water away. By late afternoon, what remained moved in thin silver threads between cracked slabs of clay and exposed stone. Heat shimmered above the ground. Dust hung in the air. And across that wounded stretch of earth, a herd of elephants kept moving toward the last safe crossing before dark. They moved with the slow certainty of animals that had followed this route for generations. The matriarch led without hesitation. Older females stayed close to the smallest calves. Tails swayed. Trunks tested the mud before each heavy step. Every few seconds, ears lifted and turned toward the faint rush of deeper water ahead. The whole herd seemed joined by one shared instinct: keep going before nightfall closed in. Only one of them had fallen out of that rhythm. At the rear, nearly 70 feet behind the others, a baby elephant named Millie stopped so often that her path looked broken. She would hurry forward 3 or 4 steps, then freeze. Her small trunk lifted high and traced the hot air behind her. Her ears stiffened. Her body leaned toward the herd, but her attention remained fixed on something far back along the trail they had come from. She was young enough that her movements should have been messy with uncertainty, but this was not ordinary hesitation. She did not shy from the ground or balk at the smell of water. She watched. She listened. She waited. Each pause felt deliberate, as if she believed the empty space behind her was only temporary, and that at any second a familiar shape would appear there and restore the world to the order she understood. Twice she pushed herself hard enough to nearly reach the adult just ahead of her, a broad female with one torn ear who slowed just long enough for Millie to brush the tip of her trunk against the older elephant's tail. But the contact never lasted. Millie would stop again, turn again, and send a low vibration into the air so soft that even nearby birds did not startle. It was less a call than a question carried in breath. From the ridge above the river, 3 people watched through field glasses as the herd descended toward the narrow crossing. Ethan Cole lowered his binoculars first. He had spent more than 3 decades around elephants, long enough to distrust easy explanations. Beside him, Dr. Lena Morris kept her gaze trained on the calf. Behind them, Maya Bennett adjusted the focus on her camera, chasing Millie through heat waves and drifting dust. Maya had been filming migration footage for 12 days, and until that afternoon she had thought she was capturing a story about drought. But the camera kept returning to the little calf at the back, the one who moved like she belonged to 2 different moments at once. On the tiny monitor, Millie looked even smaller than she did in the field, a dark shape against bleached earth, following the herd with her feet while searching for something else with her whole heart. Ethan had seen her before, 3 mornings earlier, standing beneath a cluster of acacias while the herd drifted on. At the time, distance and brush had hidden most of the scene, but not all of it. He remembered the stillness, the way Millie had touched the ground over and over with the end of her trunk, the way she would not leave, even after the other elephants had begun moving west. He had marked the behavior and said nothing, hoping it would pass. Now it had followed her all the way to the river. The matriarch stepped in first, sending water up against her chest. One by one, the others entered after her, the youngest calves pressed tightly to the adults beside them. Millie reached the bank and stopped where the mud turned dark and soft. Her front feet sank slightly. She rocked forward. She even lifted one foot as if to enter. Then her whole body drew back with a shiver that rippled from shoulder to tail. "It's not the crossing," Maya said quietly, though no one had asked. Her voice was barely louder than the wind moving through dry reeds. On the ridge, Ethan did not answer. He had already seen what she meant. Millie was not studying the water. She was looking over it, beyond it, behind herself, toward the empty land glowing orange in the dropping sun. She was standing at the edge of the river, the way some children stand at a doorway, waiting for a hand that never comes. Across the channel, the herd climbed the opposite bank in a rush of mud and glinting water. Shapes shook themselves free of the current and disappeared toward the tree line. Millie took 2 small steps into the shallows, then stopped again. This time she turned fully around. Her trunk rose and searched the air behind her in a slow circle, so patient and so certain in its hope that Maya forgot to keep filming for several seconds. Even Lena let out a breath she had meant to hide. The light was sliding away now, pulling color from the land. Shadows stretched long over the broken riverbed. Somewhere farther off, a francolin called once and fell silent. Millie remained where the water touched her ankles, too far from the herd to follow easily, too bound to whatever lay behind her to move at all. She looked small in a way that had nothing to do with size, small with waiting, small with faith, small with the kind of loyalty that does not yet understand absence. Then, so faintly that Maya thought at first it had come from her own equipment, Millie made the sound again, a deep, trembling rumble, too low to carry cleanly through the air. Ethan closed his eyes for half a second. He knew that sound, not panic, not fear. A contact call, softened by exhaustion and repetition. The kind a calf might make when she believed the one she needed was nearby, delayed, but still on the way. No one on the ridge moved right away. Below them, the baby elephant stood alone at the crossing, while the last light gathered around her like dust. The herd was gone from sight. The river kept sliding past her legs, and still Millie waited, as if love itself could hold back night a little longer, as if refusing to leave that place might somehow keep the world from becoming what it already was. For a long moment, the little elephant stayed exactly where the river held her, as if the fading light and the cooling mud might still return what the day had taken. The water moved around her legs in soft, indifferent currents. On the far bank, the herd was gone. Behind her, the dry plain stretched empty and gold, holding no answer, only distance. Millie did not understand distance the way older animals did. She understood presence and the sudden lack of it. She understood the smell that had once meant safety, the touch that had once guided her through brush and dust and crowded movement. Now, the air carried none of that. Still, she kept searching it, lifting her trunk again and again as though one good breath might fix the world. Ethan moved first. He lowered his binoculars and started down the embankment with the careful speed of a man who knew panic could spread if it was handled poorly. Lena followed after a beat, radio in one hand, her jaw set tight. Maya came last, camera hanging at her side now, no longer sure whether she was documenting wildlife or witnessing something too intimate to frame. By the time they reached the riverbank, Millie had backed out of the water and was standing where the wet sand met cracked earth. Her ears twitched at their approach, but she did not bolt. She watched them the way exhausted creatures watch a storm roll in, not with curiosity, not quite with fear, but with the dull, spent attention of something that has already used up too much of itself, waiting for one thing and getting another. Lena knelt to study the tracks. There were dozens layered over one another. The deep, round prints of the herd, smaller, staggered impressions from the calves, and one line that broke away, circled, then returned. Millie's. "She's been looping," Lena said under her breath. "Not wandering, looping." Ethan said nothing. He was staring west, toward the acacia stand he had not stopped thinking about since morning. Maya noticed it too, the way his face changed when he looked at that distant line of trees. She asked no permission before following him. Lena hesitated, then joined them, and together they moved back across the brittle ground while Millie trailed behind for several yards, then stopped, then came on again. She kept pausing as if some invisible cord tied her to the river, but she would not let the humans get far from her either. The acacias stood in a shallow dip, where the land held shade a little longer than the open flats. Beneath them, the earth was trampled down and darker, churned by many feet. The smell reached Maya first, old blood, rot, and the dry, sour tang of something the sun had worked on for days. She stopped before the others did. Her hand flew to her mouth. Even after years of fieldwork, some sights still arrived like blows. There was not much left whole. A large rib cage lay split open beneath thorn branches. One tusk was half buried in dust. Flies rose and settled in shifting black clouds. Scraps of hide clung to bone where scavengers had not finished. But the shape of the loss was unmistakable. This had been an adult female, heavy enough to have sheltered a calf at her side. Ethan crouched near the remains and looked at the prints around them. Millie did not come all the way in at first. She stood just beyond the shade line, trembling so slightly it could have been mistaken for heat. Then she took 3 hesitant steps forward. Her trunk lifted, froze in midair, and slowly lowered toward the ground. She touched a patch of dust, then another, and then one of the sun-bleached bones, with a gentleness that made Maya look away. It was not the touch of discovery. It was recognition. The calf stood there for a long time. No cry came out of her, no dramatic display, no wild confusion. There was only that stillness again, that terrible and patient stillness, as if some part of her had remained in this place while the rest had been forced onward by the herd. Ethan could see from the tracks that she had circled here over and over 3 days earlier. She had not been left once. She had refused to leave first. Lena checked the remains from a distance, clinical even in sorrow. The injury was old. A deep tear near what remained of the shoulder had likely turned septic. She was sick before she went down, Lena said quietly, maybe weakened for days. The words were practical, but they changed nothing. Millie did not need a cause. She only knew that the body she had waited beside had gone cold, and that the cold had stayed. Then, all at once, the calm broke. Millie let out a low, broken rumble and stepped closer, pressing her forehead against the trunk of the acacia, as if bracing herself against something bigger than fear. Her small body shook. She did not charge or run. She simply leaned, all of her weight sinking into the tree, while her trunk searched along the ground where her mother had once lain. The sound she made was so soft, it hurt more than a scream. Maya's eyes filled before she realized it. She had filmed animals in drought, flood, fire, and migration, but grief was harder to witness than danger. Danger moved fast. Grief stayed. Ethan rose slowly and looked back toward the river, then toward the darkening horizon. "If we leave her," he said, more to himself than to the others, "she'll come back here tonight. And if she stays here alone, she may not make it to morning." Lena's answer came sharp, almost defensive. Protocol did not allow intervention unless the animal was critically injured or an immediate human-caused threat was present. A calf separated from a herd was tragic, but tragedy was not always grounds for rescue. Ethan knew every word before she said it. He had followed those rules most of his life. But as Millie turned once more toward the bones, he also knew that not every death in the wild looked violent while it was happening. The sun had nearly dropped by then, leaving the acacias in deepening shadow. Millie took one last step toward the remains, then stopped and lifted her trunk into the empty air above them. Nothing answered, no low rumble, no footfall, no protective body moving between her and the dark. At last, she turned back toward the men and women waiting a short distance away. She did not come out of trust. She came because there was nowhere else left to wait. Night moved fast across the flats. By the time the team led Millie away from the acacias, the last orange light had drained from the sky, leaving only a bruised band at the horizon and the first cold breath of evening settling over the riverbed. The calf followed in fits and starts, not resisting exactly, but not choosing them either. She walked like something pulled by absence. Ethan kept his pace slow and angled his body so she would never feel cornered. Lena moved ahead to coordinate the transport truck waiting beyond the ridge, speaking into the radio in clipped, controlled sentences that sounded calmer than she felt. Maya stayed behind Millie, not pushing, only keeping her from doubling back toward the trees. Twice, the calf stopped and turned, and each time the darkness behind them looked deeper. The truck had been used before for injured antelope, sedated zebra, once even a leopard with a snare wound, but never for a calf like this. Millie stood at the edge of the lowered ramp, staring into the metal box as if it were another kind of river. Her ears shifted once. Her trunk slid across the ridged surface, tracing the smell of oil, dust, old hay, human hands. She did not understand it, but she understood enough to know it was not home. Lena expected a struggle then. Any healthy wild calf should have fought the narrow space, the walls, the pressure of being guided somewhere against instinct. Instead, Millie only hesitated. Ethan stepped to one side, leaving her the widest path possible, and after a long, still moment, she walked up into the transport crate on her own. That quiet obedience unsettled him more than panic would have. Fear still belonged to life. This felt closer to surrender. Once the gate latched shut, the sound rang through the evening like something final. Maya flinched. Inside the crate, Millie did not trumpet or slam herself against the sides. She planted her feet wide for balance and stood motionless except for the slow lift of her trunk toward the slats, searching the air outside. Ethan watched the tip of it curl and uncurl in the dark. Even now, she was still looking for the same missing answer. The drive back to Red Hollow Wildlife Station took nearly 6 hours over washboard roads and dry gullies. The truck shook and rattled, headlights sweeping over thorn scrub and pale stones. Every time the vehicle lurched, Millie adjusted without complaint, leaning into the movement with a tired instinct that made her seem older than her size. At one stop, Maya climbed up to peer through the side vent. She found one dark eye looking back at nothing she could see. Near midnight, the station came into view. Low buildings of timber and corrugated metal, floodlights casting hard circles over packed earth, fence lines silvered in dust. Somewhere farther in, another elephant shifted in its sleep and gave a low rumble that rolled through the compound like distant thunder. Millie heard it. Her ears lifted. For the first time since the river, something like alertness moved through her body. Not hope, exactly, just the recognition that she was not entirely alone. They led her into quarantine, a smaller enclosure set apart from the main rehabilitation pens. The gate opened. A shallow trough waited in one corner, hay and fresh browse in another, a water drum beyond that. Lena checked the latch twice before stepping back. Ethan remained near the entrance, giving the calf room. Millie descended the ramp, touched the ground, and stood very still under the yellow light, as if the earth itself had changed species beneath her feet. She did not inspect the food. She did not go to the water. Slowly, she crossed the enclosure to the farthest corner from the gate and turned her body toward the fence, presenting her back to the world that had brought her here. Her trunk hung low, almost brushing the dirt. Maya felt an ache rise in her chest so quickly it surprised her. The whole long rescue, all the procedure and motion and decision, had led to this one small figure facing away. Lena completed her notes with the efficient precision of habit. Female calf. Approximate age under 1 year. No visible fractures. Minor abrasions to the feet. No severe dehydration. Stable enough for observation. The words were clinically true and emotionally useless. Ethan read them over her shoulder and handed the clipboard back without comment. Survival on paper had very little to do with whatever country Millie was trapped in now. When the others drifted off to let the station quiet settle, Ethan stayed a while outside the fence. He kept his hands at his sides and his breathing easy. Millie never turned around. Once, she shifted her weight and lifted her trunk halfway, as if she had heard something beyond the enclosure. Ethan waited, wondering if she might glance back. She did not. Whatever she was listening for did not live among metal gates and lantern light. Around 2 a.m, the night keeper passed by on his rounds and found her in the same position. The browse remained untouched. The water level had not moved. The calf was awake, rigid in the corner, one hind foot cocked as if she had nearly dozed and startled herself back to standing. When he whispered the report to Ethan through the half-open office door, Ethan sat up at once, but did not rush out. Some grief, he knew, only hardened under attention. By dawn, a thin gray light had spread over the compound. Birds began fussing in the acacia trees outside the perimeter fence. Another orphan in the next enclosure splashed in its trough and rattled a chain toy against a post. Millie had not slept for more than minutes at a time. She had not eaten. Yet, when the first workers crossed the yard, she flinched, turned her head sharply, and searched the opening gate as if part of her still believed the one she had lost might somehow arrive late. Maya saw her then from the walkway and lifted her camera without thinking. Through the lens, the calf looked impossibly small inside that large, practical pen, a wild thing compressed into straight lines and right angles. But what struck Maya most was not Millie's size. It was the stubbornness of her waiting. Even here, after the river, after the bones, after the road, she had not truly given up. Some part of her was still keeping watch. Morning settled over Red Hollow with the dry, ordinary sounds of work beginning. Gates clicked open and shut. Buckets knocked against posts. A hose dragged across packed dirt with a low, scraping hiss. In the quarantine pen, Millie stood where she had been through the night, her body angled toward the far fence, as if the safest thing left in the world was to expect nothing and turn away first. She had eaten almost nothing by noon. A little torn browse lay scattered near her feet, where she had tested it, then dropped it untouched. The water in the trough held the faint dust rings of her trunk, but no sign that she had truly drunk. When another calf called from a nearby enclosure, Millie stiffened and lifted her head, listening with a focus so sharp it seemed to hurt her. Then the sound faded, and she folded back into silence. Lena examined her from outside the fence, making notes in a low voice for the station records. No fever, no obvious infection, mild exhaustion, elevated startle response. Ethan listened without interrupting. On paper, the calf was surviving. In the enclosure itself, survival looked thinner than that word suggested. Her body was present. Her instincts were working. But something in her still seemed fixed beside the acacias under the place where her mother had fallen. Maya kept returning with the camera and leaving with it still mostly lowered. She had come to Red Hollow expecting rescue footage, the kind that carried a clear emotional shape. Danger, intervention, relief. But Millie offered none of that. There was no dramatic improvement, no grateful leaning into human hands, no moment the lens could frame as hope. There was only a very young elephant standing inside grief, as if it had become the only climate she understood. On the third morning, Ethan entered the pen for the first time. He carried nothing but a dented folding chair and an old leather-field notebook softened by years of use. He did not approach Millie directly. He set the chair down near the middle of the enclosure, well outside the invisible ring of space she defended, and sat with the slow, unthreatening movements of someone who knew speed could feel like violence. Millie did not turn to look. He stayed for nearly 2 hours that first day. He did not speak to her. He did not whistle, or click his tongue, or make the gentle coaxing sounds handlers sometimes used with nervous animals. After a while, he opened the notebook and began reading aloud, not to her exactly, but into the air between them. His voice was low and worn smooth by age, carrying notes about weather, herd movement, dry river crossings, old injuries healed, and old losses recorded without decoration. The words meant nothing to Millie, but the rhythm of them did. A steady human voice that asked nothing of her, was different from boots, from gates, from the sharp metal sounds of the station. Once, midway through the reading, her right ear flicked backward toward him. Later, the tip of her trunk lifted a few inches from the dirt, hovered, then lowered again. Ethan noticed every change and answered none of them. Pressure, he knew, could break what patience might someday open. He returned the next day and the day after that, always with the same chair, the same careful distance, the same refusal to demand contact. Sometimes he read from the notebook, sometimes from a weathered paperback, novel he kept in his truck, turning pages slowly while light shifted through the pen. Once he simply sat in silence for nearly an hour, head tilted back against the post behind him, as if he had nowhere more urgent to be than beside a calf who pretended he did not exist. Millie began to change in increments so small they could have been mistaken for chance. She no longer pressed herself into the farthest corner every moment he was there. By the end of the first week, she was standing 10 feet nearer than before, though always with her body angled away. Twice she tore leaves from a branch while he sat reading, chewing without appetite, but without waiting for him to leave first. It was not trust yet. It was only less refusal. Maya noticed the pattern before she admitted it aloud. Each time Ethan came, the enclosure seemed to hold a slightly different tension, like a room after someone opens a window no one else had seen. Lena remained skeptical of anything sentimental in the change. "She's conserving energy," she said one afternoon. "Sometimes that looks like progress." Ethan only nodded. He had no interest in naming what had not fully arrived. Names, applied too soon, had a way of misleading people. Then came the rain. Not a full storm, only one of those brief, sharp afternoon showers that darkened the dust and vanished almost as quickly as it came. The first crack of thunder rolled over the station, and Millie startled so hard her whole body jerked sideways. She spun once toward the gate, trunk raised high, searching wildly. Ethan was already in the pen, seated with the notebook open across one knee. He did not stand. He did not call her name. He simply stayed. For several seconds, she froze with every muscle drawn tight. Then, without seeming to choose it, she shifted her weight in his direction. One slow step, then another. The rain tapped against the metal roofline and hissed in the dirt beyond the fence. Millie stopped again, trembling, close, enough now to see the lines in Ethan's face and the stillness he was holding for her. He kept his eyes lowered to the page, not from indifference, but to make himself easier to bear. She stretched her trunk toward him at last, tentative and shaking at the tip. The first touch landed against the leg of the folding chair, then slid upward to the cuff of his pants. Fabric, mud, salt, sun. She followed the seam of his shirt with a careful sweep, then paused at the back of his hand. Ethan did not move. The whole pen seemed to narrow around that contact, not because it was dramatic, but because it was the first thing Millie had chosen since the river. After a few seconds, she withdrew and stepped back, as if surprised by her own decision. The thunder had already moved farther off. Rainwater dripped from the fence wire in bright, temporary beads. Ethan turned one page in the notebook and kept reading in the same, even voice, granting the moment no ceremony. Millie stood in place, listening, no longer hidden in the corner, no longer entirely turned away. It was a small shift, almost nothing. But at Red Hollow, almost nothing was how healing first announced itself. By the second week, the station had settled into a rhythm that Millie no longer resisted with the same hard silence. Dawn brought the scrape of rakes and the low rumble of other elephants waking in nearby enclosures. Heat rose early off the packed ground. Ethan still came each morning with the folding chair and the old notebook, never closer than she allowed, never asking for more than the day could bear. Millie had begun eating before sunset now, though without any real hunger in it. She stripped bark, tugged at branches, drank in slow, cautious pulls, always keeping part of her attention turned toward Ethan's corner of the enclosure. If he shifted in his chair, her ears moved. If he closed the notebook, her trunk lifted. She was not relaxed. She was orienting, the way a lost thing begins to map the shape of a single steady presence. Maya caught those changes before anyone else said them aloud. Through the long lens, she could see the tiny recalibrations in Millie's body. Less rigidity across the shoulders, fewer abrupt startles, longer stretches when her trunk rested instead of searching. None of it looked cinematic in the obvious way. Yet the footage carried a quiet pull. It showed a creature inching toward the edge of trust, without knowing if the ground there would hold. One morning, Ethan stood for the first time while she was near him. He did it slowly, giving her every chance to retreat. Millie backed up 3 steps, then stopped and watched. He crossed to the water trough, rinsed his hands, and came back without looking directly at her. That evening, when the station settled under a red sky and the other calves began their low contact rumbles, Millie remained standing where he had left the chair, breathing against the canvas seat. The next progression came at the bathing pond. A shallow oval basin dug years earlier for orphans too young or too frightened to venture into the deeper rehabilitation pools. Lena thought it might help loosen the dust packed in the folds of Millie's skin and give them a better read on her physical state. Maya suspected Ethan had another reason. Water had been the place where Millie's world had broken apart. It might also be the place where it started to bend back. The first day, she would not enter. She stood at the edge with her front feet sunk into damp mud, staring at the ripples Ethan made as he waded in alone. He said nothing. He only moved through the water with the same deliberate calm he carried everywhere around her, scooping it over his arms, over his neck, letting the ordinary sound of it fill the silence. After several minutes, Millie stepped 1 foot forward, then another, and stopped with a shudder. The next day, she went in up to her knees. On the third, she allowed him to splash water gently along her flank with a flat bucket. By the 5th, she was standing beside him in the pond while dragonflies skimmed the surface and sunlight flashed in broken patterns across her wet skin. Maya filmed from the bank, lens fixed on the space between them, sensing something was building there that had less to do with comfort than with memory. It happened without warning. Ethan had turned slightly away to refill the bucket when Millie moved behind him and wrapped her trunk around his waist. Not playfully. Not with the clumsy curiosity of a calf investigating a new object. She held him with a force that was careful and desperate at once, pressing the front of her head against the middle of his back, as if she were trying to anchor him to the world by touch alone. Ethan went completely still. He did not reach for her or turn around. The water lapped softly against both of them. Maya forgot to breathe. Even Lena, watching from beneath the shade awning with a clipboard in her hand, lowered it without realizing. Millie's body was trembling. A vibration ran through her trunk and into Ethan's torso, too low for the others to hear clearly, but enough for him to feel. It was grief, translated into contact. She held him for only a few seconds, though it felt longer to everyone watching. When she released him, her trunk slid across his side and off his shoulder in one lingering line. Then she stepped back, ears half spread, eyes fixed on him with a nakedness none of them had seen before. Ethan still did not move quickly. He only turned with great care and faced her, standing chest-deep in water, both of them caught in a silence that seemed to change the whole enclosure. That evening, The station buzzed with the kind of cautious excitement rescue teams tried not to indulge. A breakthrough, one handler called it. Maya replayed the footage alone in the editing room and felt tears rise before she could stop them. In every frame, the moment looked like salvation. The lonely calf had chosen someone. The broken bond had found a new shape. It was exactly the kind of scene that made people believe healing was visible when it happened. But Ethan did not look relieved. He sat outside the quarantine pen after dusk, elbows on his knees, watching Millie eat near the fence for the first time. Lena joined him without speaking for a while. Finally, she said what he had not wanted to say first. That wasn't recovery. He kept his eyes on the calf. No, he answered quietly. It was transfer. The word landed heavy between them, clinical and merciless and true. Over the next several days, the pattern sharpened. Millie began waiting for the sound of Ethan's truck before she touched her morning brows. She paced when he was late. She settled when he appeared. Once, when he was called away to help with a wound on another orphan's leg, she struck the gate with her trunk so hard she split the skin near the tip. Maya saw the blood and went pale. Ethan cleaned the scrape himself, his face unreadable. The danger was no longer theoretical. What had looked so beautiful in the pond now showed its shadow. Millie was coming back to life. Yes, but around him, not around her own kind. She was stitching the torn edges of herself to the nearest steady body, the nearest daily certainty, the nearest thing that had not disappeared. And the cruelest part was this. It was working. Her appetite had returned. Her sleep was deeper. Her eyes followed movement again. The bridge was helping her cross, and that was exactly why it could not remain. Ethan began pulling away the very next morning, not all at once, but with the kind of restraint that hurt precisely because it was measured. He did not take the chair into the pen. He left it outside the fence where Millie could still see him, still hear the turn of notebook pages, still mark the familiar shape of his shoulders in the light. But the distance between them had changed, and she knew it before anyone said a word. At first, she did not understand. She walked to the gate and stood there, waiting for the ordinary sequence to correct itself. When it did not, she reached her trunk through the gaps in the fencing, searching for his sleeve, his hand, the knee of his worn canvas pants. Ethan remained seated on the other side, reading in the same low voice he had used for weeks, except now the sound came to her across wire instead of open air. Millie's confusion was quiet on the first day. She followed him along the fence line when he stood to leave, matching his pace from inside the enclosure with small, urgent steps. At the corner, where the fence bent and the shadows thickened, she stopped and made a soft rumble into the empty space between them. Ethan paused, but did not turn back. Maya watched from the feed shed, anger rising hot and fast in her throat. By the third day, the confusion had sharpened into distress. Millie began refusing food during the hours Ethan was on the property, but out of sight. She paced the boundary closest to the main yard until the dust there turned dark under her feet. When his truck engine sounded beyond the acacias, she would rush to the gate and stand trembling, only to find him crossing instead toward another enclosure, another orphan, another task that did not include her. Maya confronted him at noon beside the water drums, voice low but shaking. She told him the calf was unraveling, that anyone could see it, that what he was doing looked less like rehabilitation than betrayal. Ethan let her finish. The older man's face did not harden, but it closed in a way she had not seen before. "If she builds her life around me," he said, "then I'm just teaching her another loss she won't survive." Lena heard the exchange and said nothing until Maya had stormed off toward the equipment shed. Then she stepped beside Ethan and stared through the heat shimmer toward the quarantine pen. Millie was standing at the fence, trunk lifted, body still as a post, driven into the earth. "You could ease this," Lena said quietly, "for a while." Ethan nodded once. "That's the problem. For a while." Neither of them moved. The calf's calls changed as the week went on. The soft, low vibrations she had once used at the river gave way to higher, more urgent sounds, the kind young elephants made when separation moved from uncertainty into panic. At dusk, she stood by the gate and called into the yard until the station lights came on one by one. More than once, other calves answered from their own pens, but Millie did not turn toward them. Her entire body remained trained on absence. One evening, she tried to force the issue. A keeper had failed to latch the inner chain tightly after topping off the trough, and Millie found the weakness with the relentless precision of a creature motivated by grief. By the time the guard noticed, she had shoved the gate open several inches and bloodied the bridge of her trunk, trying to widen the gap. The full yard erupted in shouted warnings and running feet. Yet when Ethan appeared, she did not bolt. She only reached for him. He stopped 10 feet away. That distance looked unbearable on her. Blood darkened the dust beneath her mouth. Her trunk stretched toward him, shaking at the tip. Every instinct in Maya's body screamed for him to close the space, to give the touch the calf was begging for, to end the scene before it burned itself into everyone watching. Ethan stood where he was, breathing slowly, making himself hold the line that compassion kept trying to erase. It was Lena who stepped in first, not with comfort, but with procedure. She had the med kit open before anyone asked. While 2 handlers secured the gate, she approached Millie at an angle and cleaned the torn skin with cool saline. The calf flinched once, then went rigid. Ethan remained in sight, but outside, reached the whole time. Maya turned away, unable to decide which hurt more, the blood, the crying, or the fact that the man Millie trusted most was refusing to become the answer. The station changed after that night. Even the workers who agreed with Ethan grew quieter around him. A few questioned Lena outright, asking whether the calf wasn't too young for this kind of hard boundary, whether the emotional cost might undo everything they had gained. Lena's answers stayed clinical, but she took longer to write her notes and checked on Millie more often after dark. Conviction did not make the work feel kind. It only made it necessary. Then Ruby arrived. She came in a stock trailer at the end of a wind-blown afternoon. A lanky female orphan, a little older than Millie, with a torn notch in one ear and a steadiness that made her seem older still. Ruby had been at the satellite pasture for months and was being transferred back for social pairing trials. She carried her own history of loss, but she wore it differently. Less like an open wound, more like scar tissue that had learned to flex. They placed Ruby in the adjoining enclosure the next morning. At first, Millie barely noticed. She stood at her usual stretch of fence, facing the yard where Ethan sometimes appeared, every sense still tuned to the old pattern she could not stop hoping would return. Ruby, meanwhile, explored the boundary between them with patient interest, brushing the wire with her trunk, breathing through it, making low conversational rumbles that expected no immediate reply. Late that afternoon, Ethan took his place on the far side of Millie's fence, as he had every day that week. He opened the notebook and began to read. Millie went to him at once, reaching through the wire, but he stayed just beyond contact. The moment held. Then, from the enclosure beside her, Ruby let out a single soft rumble. Not loud, not demanding, just present. Millie froze. For the first time in days, she turned away from Ethan's still figure and listened to someone else. Ruby did not rush her. That was the first thing Millie seemed to understand. The older calf stayed near the shared fence without crowding it, sometimes touching the wire with the tip of her trunk, sometimes drifting away to strip bark or toss dust over her back, as if companionship could be offered without insistence. Millie watched her in fragments at first, never for long, always returning to the yard where Ethan used to sit inside her world instead of beyond it. For several days, the two calves lived beside each other in a quiet negotiation. Ruby would rumble softly while feeding, and Millie, despite herself, began to pause and listen. At night, when the station settled and the floodlights drew pale bars across the ground, Millie sometimes moved closer to the dividing fence than to the outer gate. She still called for Ethan when dusk made the shadows longer. But now, there was another sound in her darkness. The first contact came without ceremony. Ruby was standing with one forefoot bent, half dozing in the late heat, when Millie stepped to the mesh and stretched her trunk through one of the wider squares. She did not reach far, only enough to brush the edge of Ruby's shoulder. Ruby turned, lifted her own trunk, and answered with a touch so light it barely disturbed the dust on Millie's skin. Then both calves stood still, as if testing whether gentleness could be trusted. Maya saw it from across the yard and forgot the clipboard in her hand. No one had to explain what mattered about that small exchange. It was not dramatic. No music would have swelled for it. But it was the first time since the river that Millie chose contact that did not lead back to a human body. Ethan, standing near the tool shed with a length of hose over one shoulder, watched for only a second before turning away to finish his work. The station staff began adjusting routines around the new possibility. Feed was delivered to the two enclosures at the same time. Enrichment logs were placed near the shared fence. On cooler mornings, Lena supervised brief periods when the calves could drink side by side from troughs set opposite each other, close enough for trunks to meet through the mesh. Ruby remained calm through all of it. Her steadiness gave Millie something Ethan never could, the shape of an elephant life continuing forward. There were setbacks, of course. Recovery at Red Hollow had never moved in a straight line, and no one expected it to start now. Some mornings, Millie woke withdrawn, standing with her body closed off and her attention turned back toward the yard. If Ethan's truck passed too near her enclosure, she would still hurry to the fence and lift her trunk with that old ache rising through her. But the difference was this. When he kept walking, she no longer collapsed into pure panic. More and more often, she turned to find Ruby instead. By the third week of their pairing, the gate between the two pens was opened for the first supervised contact. Lena stood with the emergency team nearby, her radio clipped high against her collar. Maya was already in position with her camera, though she knew better now than to expect a neat moment of triumph. Ethan remained back from the scene entirely. He had argued for that. If Millie was going to cross toward her own kind, he did not want his presence tipping the balance. Ruby entered first, moving with easy caution into the neutral space between the enclosures. Millie hesitated near the threshold, every line of her body recalling another threshold, another crossing, another place where she had once stopped and refused to go on. For a long beat, she seemed suspended between past and present. Then Ruby turned sideways, not confronting her, not demanding, simply making room. Millie stepped through. They circled each other once, trunks lifting, touching, gathering information the way elephants always had. Ruby checked the corners of Millie's mouth, the scent beneath her eyes, the folds at the base of her ears. Millie responded with the nervous politeness of someone entering a room where everyone else already knew the rules. When Ruby gave a low rumble and moved toward a pile of fresh-cut branches, Millie followed, not pressed to her side, not dependent, but close enough to learn the rhythm. That afternoon brought the first real play anyone had seen from Millie. It began almost by accident, when Ruby hooked a strip of bark with her trunk and yanked it free, sending it skittering over the dirt. Millie startled, then lunged after it. For a few awkward seconds, the two calves pushed and tugged at the same branch, ears out, feet stamping, not in aggression, but in the clumsy rehearsal of a life that included other bodies again. Maya laughed out loud before she could stop herself. The changes gathered quietly after that. Millie started sleeping nearer the center of the enclosure, instead of the far corner. She synchronized her feeding with Ruby's, moved when Ruby moved, paused when Ruby paused. When thunder rolled over the station one evening, Millie did not rush the outer fence looking for Ethan. She crossed the pen and stood shoulder to shoulder with Ruby beneath the shelter, trembling only until the other calf's low rumble steadied the air between them. Soon, two more young orphans were introduced across neighboring barriers, widening Millie's world by degrees. A broad-headed male named Jasper tried to steal branches from everyone, and a shy female called June preferred to watch before joining in. Ruby handled them with practiced ease. Millie copied what she could, missed some cues, learned others. She discovered how to wait her turn at the trough, how to move aside without retreating, how to touch another trunk without asking it to hold all her fear. Maya noticed something else too, something she never said aloud, because naming it felt like a superstition. Millie had begun to look bigger, though her measurements alone did not explain it. Her body no longer seemed arranged around loss in quite the same way. She still carried it. Maya could see that in the pauses, in the occasional far-off look when evening light hit the yard just right. But she was carrying other things now too. Curiosity, irritation, appetite, play, the first rough edges of belonging. Late one evening, after the younger group had settled, Ethan stood outside the main rehabilitation area and watched Millie through the fence. Ruby was beside her, both calves half hidden in the lavender dusk, their trunks draped near each other in sleep. Millie did not wake when he came. She did not lift her head at the sound of his boots or search the dark for the shape of him. Ethan stood there longer than necessary, then turned and walked back toward the yard, knowing that for the first time, her healing had moved somewhere he could not follow. By the time Millie had been at Red Hollow for nearly 8 months, the station no longer revolved around her crisis. That, more than anything, told the truth of how far she had come. She ate with the others, moved with the others, and responded to the small, shifting rules of herd life with growing ease. There were still quiet setbacks, still mornings when some hidden memory closed around her. but they no longer defined the shape of every day. The discussions about release began in the office just after sunrise, while light spilled across maps pinned to the wall and dust drifted through the open windows. Lena wanted more time. Maya, though less certain than before, felt the same pull of caution. But Ethan argued that the station had done what it was meant to do. Millie had not been saved, so she could remain inside fences. She had been saved so she could one day live beyond them. The plan moved forward with the careful seriousness of people who understood that a bad release could undo months of recovery in a single week. Millie and Ruby would go together to a protected reserve along the Namibia border, where a large boma had been built near a known elephant corridor. The setup would allow them to acclimate to the new terrain, while wild herds passed near enough for scent and sound to begin doing their ancient work. When moving day came, the station rose before dawn. The air was cool, almost tender, and for a brief hour, the whole compound seemed to hold its breath. Millie entered the transport crate more willingly this time, following Ruby up the ramp after only a short hesitation. Maya filmed from a distance, aware of the strange ache in watching a creature leave the very place where she had learned how to stay alive. Ethan did not stand at the truck door. He stayed back and let her go without one last touch. The reserve was wider and quieter than Red Hollow, the land opening into pale grass, low mopane woodland, and the long invisible roads elephants made with memory instead of maps. The boma sat in a clearing with water nearby and old tracks pressed into the earth beyond it. Millie stepped down into the enclosure and lifted her trunk high, testing a world that smelled different from the station, less human, less managed, and full of lives she did not yet know. The first 3 days were harder than anyone admitted out loud. Millie stayed close to Ruby and moved little, as though one more change had emptied the last reserve of confidence she had built. She startled at night sounds, stood too long in one spot, and twice turned toward the transport gate at dawn, as if expecting the old routines of Red Hollow to reassemble around her. Maya, watching from the blind, felt fear creep back in. Healing, she was learning, could always be asked to prove itself again. Then the wild herd came. It happened in the gray calm of early morning, when the light was still thin and the birds had only just begun to call. 21 elephants appeared between the trees and moved toward the water with the easy authority of animals who belonged entirely to themselves. The matriarch noticed the strangers inside the boma almost at once. She slowed. The rest of the herd slowed with her. And suddenly the whole clearing felt arranged around an old decision no human could make. Millie froze at first. Her ears widened. Her trunk lifted and stayed there, shaking slightly at the tip. Ruby answered the first distant rumble with one of her own, soft but clear. Then the matriarch came closer, stopping just beyond the timber wall. Other females spread out behind her. A young bull approached and withdrew. A calf about Millie's size pressed forward curiously, then hid behind an ant. Through the gaps in the posts, scent passed before courage did. For nearly 2 hours, the encounter held. The wild elephants touched the boma walls with their trunks, breathed through the openings, exchanged low conversations beneath the edge of human hearing. Millie moved from fear into something more complicated. She stepped toward them, then back to Ruby, then forward again. She was no longer the calf at the river, waiting for one lost body to return. But she was not yet certain she could belong to many. The possibility itself seemed almost too large for her. The gates were opened on the 6th day. No one forced the calves out. That was part of the design. They were free to leave and free to retreat. And for a while, that was exactly what they did. Ruby crossed first. Millie followed a minute later, every muscle ready to whirl back if the ground itself proved wrong. They made it 30 yards that day before returning to the safety of the boma. The next day, they went farther. Then, farther still. The wild herd continued to pass every few days, never staging a dramatic acceptance, never offering the kind of moment human beings like to call rescue. Instead, they did what elephants do. They repeated contact until contact became ordinary. Millie learned the shape of their route, the timing of their pauses, the way younger calves tucked close when older females gave a warning rumble. She began walking beside them for short stretches, then longer ones, returning at first to the boma by nightfall, then later by dawn, then not at all. The day she failed to come back was almost painfully undramatic. Ruby returned near sunset and stood at the edge of the old clearing, listening toward the trees. Millie did not appear behind her. The team waited through the evening, through moonrise, through the first cold hours before dawn. Nothing. At sunrise, trackers picked up the truth in the prints. Millie had stayed with the herd through the night, bedding down among them as though the decision had happened not in one brave instant, but in 100 smaller choices already made. Weeks later, a drone team caught footage from above a muddy crossing after a short rain. Maya saw it first in the field station and sat down without meaning to. A line of elephants was moving across unstable ground, adults angling around a deep patch where water hid the worst of the sink. Near the center, a young female stepped sideways, blocked a smaller calf from following the wrong path, then guided it around the danger with the firm, calm certainty of someone who knew what hesitation could cost. It was Millie. The shock was not that she survived. It was not even that she had joined the herd. It was the way she moved now, steady, attentive, already carrying the beginnings of responsibility. The calf who had once stood at a river and refused to cross without the mother she had lost had become the kind of young elephant who helped another cross safely. Maya watched the clip 3 times in silence before calling Red Hollow. When Ethan answered, she could not speak for a moment. Then she simply said, "You need to see what she became." If this story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments for Millie. If you believe healing sometimes means letting go, leave a 0. And if you want more powerful animal stories like this, stories about loss, survival, and second chances, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Your comment may be simple, but it means a lot. And the next story is waiting for you.